Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 231, and I am the show's host, Kyle. Returning to the show is Will Porter, who is a freelance journalist and, does a lot of research and investigation into Mideast affairs and U.S. foreign policy. His work can be found at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and of course, libertarianinstitute.org. And that's where you can find my daily news roundup and the podcast there, Foreign Policy Focus, on the homepage. So, Will, welcome back to the show. I think this is like 26th or 27th appearance now.
Hey, thank you for having me back on, man. I'm glad to come back.
No problem. And the feedback is always great when I have Will on. I always hear, I really love your show, especially the episodes with Will. So that means you're getting more Will Porter. And today we're going to be talking some Iran news. Of course, the situation with Iran, I think, has kind of been like sneakily under the headlines in a little bit of ways where the more like the anti-war crowd has really been talking about what's going on in Israel and Palestine because there's some bombing going on there. The operation to retake Hadada from the Houthis has restarted. There's peace talks developing in Afghanistan and what's going on in North Korea. But then you have sanctions being re-added to Iran and Trump drawing a lot of attention there. And of course, the mainstream media can't get past, whatever mean thing that Trump said today. I guess he insulted somebody in a burqa I saw on Anthony Smirnov's Facebook wall, and that was the 2 minutes of hate for the day. So, Will, we have the Iran sanctions coming back on. Where we start with these sanctions is that these are part of the sanctions that were lifted as Iran signing on to the JCPOA. Of course, that was done, I believe it was all agreed to in 2015 under Obama. Trump then announced the United States was withdrawing from the JCPOA. That's the Iran nuclear deal in May. And according to that agreement, the sanctions couldn't come back on, the day after it was, rejected by the United States. However, the United States is putting some sanctions on now, and then the oil sanctions will come back on in November. So that's kind of where we are with the sanctions, Will, but why don't you talk a little bit generally about sanctions? Because like I said, this story has, I felt like, flown a little bit under the radar. Part of that could, too, be that people really don't understand what sanctions are and why they're bad.
Sure. I think you might be right there. Sanctions are kind of just like it can be kind of esoteric and economic, financial jargon. But yeah, as you said, Trump reimposed sanctions on Iran earlier this week, I think Monday or Tuesday, in part of what he calls another maximum pressure campaign. And so that we sort of heard the same kind of rhetoric when he was talking about North Korea. However, it should be noted just at the outset here that sanctions are basically an act of war. These sanctions that we're imposing aren't just things that affect the Iranian military or like the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. This hurts their entire economy and makes their entire society suffer. So these new sanctions are going to target, among other things, Iran's purchases of U.S. dollars, their trading in precious metals, their coal industry, their industrial software industry, and I think even their auto sector. And so a lot of these things are going to be very harmful to the average Iranian. And as you said later, there's going to be more sanctions on their oil sector. And so that's one of their most important export sectors. And so I would say definitely that one of the intended effects of sanctions is to do just that, is to impose sort of suffering on average Iranians. And that's always kind of one of the intended effects of sanctions is to make the population put pressure on their own government to sort of change their ways and go along with American demands. But that idea that this will do that these sanctions will have that effect, I don't think is borne out in the case of Iran. The more likely result you get by doing this is that you sort of inspire like a siege mentality in the people of Iran. It makes them see their own government sort of as like a protector from the West. And at the same time, because you're putting so much pressure on them economically, you engender hatred of the West. It has the absolute opposite effect of what is intended. And I think the Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi put this very well himself when he said, sanctions destroy societies, but do not weaken regimes.
Right. And, this isn't like secret information either. It's not like when I was first learning about sanctions, they kind of painted it as, well, then Maduro or the Ayatollah or Kim Jong-un was use the sanctions as propaganda. But at the same time, like the president of the United States just flat out says it. Donald Trump says, like, this is a maximum pressure campaign. When some North Koreans turned up dead in Japan, they said the sanctions are starting to bite. George, I think it was H.W. Bush talked about, or maybe it was during the Clinton presidency, they talked about how, the point of the Iraqi sanctions was to get the Iraqis to overthrow the Saddam regime. And of course, I should obviously know this was Hillary Clinton because Madeleine Albright famously said that they thought the price was worth it, that 500,000 Iraqi children suffering and dying to death under the U.S. sanctions regime was worth it to try to get the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And so it's stated. It doesn't have to like come through, the Venezuelan Ministry of Truth, or it doesn't have to go through the Ayatollah. Average Iranians who just read online and know English could listen to Donald Trump saying that the sanctions are meant to bite. They're meant to hurt the Iranian economy.
Right, exactly. Like the Iraq sanctions in the 90s was a great example, I think, of the very same thing, because they had the same sort of intended effect of making Iraqis revolt against Saddam Hussein. But it failed to do that. It failed to make Iraqis revolt in any such way, and actually had the opposite outcome. It made not just Iraqis, but people around the entire world despise the United States for imposing that much suffering on innocent people. In fact, that was one of the things cited by Osama bin Laden himself when he, aired his grievances about American foreign policy. That was one of the things, killing so many Iraqis with sanctions. And so it really has the opposite of the intended effect there. But I think the more immediate goal that Trump has here is to just bring the Iranians to the negotiation table itself. The thing about hurting the population, that's sort of more roundabout. It's, that has more steps involved. Whereas like the immediate goal I think that Trump has is to do what he tried to do with the North Koreans and exert pressure and bring them to the negotiation table.
Yeah,
However,
I would just add, the way Trump talks about it, and I agree with you, Will, that the point is to get him to the negotiating table. But I think Donald Trump is under the impression that the leaders know that if the people suffer, that they're going to have to negotiate or else they're going to be overthrown. You know what I mean? So I don't think Donald Trump is thinking that, this is, going to pressure the leader of Iran to talk on its own. I think he understands that, it would be Iran doing this to relieve pressure on the regime that's created by the sanctions.
Right. But I think in either case, like the sanctions will not have that intended effect of driving Iranians against their government in that way, or of driving the Iranian government to the negotiation table. Like the U.S., as we've noted on this show many times, struck a very solid deal with the Iranians in 2015 with the JCPOA. So like Trump pulling out of it can only be taken by the Iranians as like the deepest insult and the greatest show of bad faith. And so I don't think it matters really how much sanctions you impose on Iran. Like having done that, you've really like soured relations. You've really made negotiation a lot less likely. Whereas with the North Korean case, there might be some differences there simply because like the sort of animosity between the U.S. and North Korea, the conflict about the agreed framework and stuff, that happened like a decade ago. Whereas the Iran deal thing just happened like this year,
Right, and I talk a lot about this in my episode that titled Trump's Foreign Policy Playbook. And in that I go into how with the North Korean situation, I don't think the sanctions are responsible, or at least, not the major reason why the talks occurred. I think most of it had to do with the South Korean president there, Moon Jae-in. But with the Iran sanctions as well, I think a question that we could ask ourselves is, what kind of deal could Trump possibly be looking for? And what could the Iranians possibly give up? If the Iranian nuclear deal truly is the worst agreement in history, what could Iran possibly do and give up that would appease Donald Trump?
I mean, I don't think there's anything, like, there is no answer to that question. I think it's just like maximum, like, Trump wants a blank check, basically. He wants Iran to do anything that, not just the United States, but what Israel and Saudi are, very close bosom buddy allies want as well. And it should be noted that Saudi and Israel both also see Iran as like their greatest adversary. And so we're sort of in a block with them. And so, yeah, I don't think there is anything that Iran could do that would really satisfy Trump here, except for, accept a blank check.
And just to add to that, Will, when it comes to Iran, it's hard to see how Trump could possibly get a better deal than Obama already had under the JCPOA. I wouldn't be surprised had, Trump made that agreement rather than Obama if he wouldn't have hailed it as the best agreement in history. And to, some extent, he would have a point. If you look at what America gave up for the Iran nuclear deal, which was basically just relief of sanctions, and most of these were imposed by the international community, so allowing like Russia and China and the EU countries to trade with Iran, it would open up, Iran to all these new markets. And in agreement and in exchange, Iran would then limit their nuclear, how much they enrich their nuclear fuel to 3.6% from 20%, which is only medical grade. So what Iran essentially did is they said, okay, We're not going to enrich our uranium now to make our own medicine switch, which is certainly something that, has handicapped Iran a little bit. They have destroyed their heavy water reactor, which is the reactor that produces the fuel closest to what you need to make a nuclear weapon. And so if you're looking to make a nuclear weapon, that's certainly the fastest way to do it would be with the product of the heavy water reactor. They've also limited their number of centrifuges, something that, again, if you want to make a nuclear weapon, you would have to be spinning a lot of these centrifuges to make the enriched uranium levels that you need as quick as possible. So what happened in this deal is it moved Iran a full year away from being able to obtain a nuclear weapon should they want one. There's no evidence that Iran wants a nuclear bomb, that they've ever pursued making a nuclear bomb. However, if, tomorrow the Ayatollah and the Iranian people all wake up and say they want a nuclear weapon more than anything, if they, think I want a nuclear weapon more than anything, they're a year away. Also, the sanctions are not the sanctions, the inspections agreed to within the nuclear agreement by the IAEA ensured that if Iran were to start making a nuclear weapon, the United States would know right away. And the JCPOA also ensures that all those international sanctions go back on Iran as soon as Iran violates that agreement. So, Will, I'll let you take it from there. Sorry, I just wanted to make it clear that the JCPOA was a really good deal. And now that we're putting sanctions back on Iran because we withdrew from the JCPOA, it's just extremely disappointing. And it makes you think if Trump has to sign a better deal with the Iranians to save face, because of course, I think Trump's ego would play a role there. I just don't see a way how the Iranians could possibly sign on to a better agreement, especially since some of the concessions they made under the original agreement are irreversible.
Yeah, you're just not going to get, if your concern is to limit the Iranian nuclear weapons, or there wasn't ever a nuclear weapons program, their nuclear program in general, their civilian nuclear energy program, if your desire is to limit that, then you're really not going to get a better deal than the JCPOA. It should also be noted here too that when we talk about how Trump abrogated the deal, it was not because they say they don't even claim Iran violated any part of the deal. Trump just says it was a bad deal because it doesn't address every single issue under the sun, including, Iran's other sort of geopolitical activities. But yeah, if your concern is Iranian nuclear weapons, then the JCPOA, you really cannot top that.
So, I want to move into a little bit talk about these particular sanctions that are being put on Iran, and then how that's going to kind of affect the geopolitical game. Because that's one of the things going on here, is that some countries are saying, hell no, we don't agree to these sanctions. And, by the way the Trump administration is trying to apply it, they're trying to force all the countries to follow along with the U.S. sanctions against Iran, even though, as Will said, they weren't in agreement, are in breach of the nuclear agreement in the first place. But, Will, do you want to talk a little bit about how sanctions are enforced and, basically what the United States is doing here is just preventing businesses from around the world from doing business with Iran and how that actually happens?
Yeah, sure. So with sanctions, you have sort of two types of sanctions, two main types of sanctions. You have what are called primary sanctions, which would include the direct freezing of assets. So the United States government freezes Iranian assets, or specific restrictions on American citizens from doing business with Iranians, or an outright trade embargo. So those are all primary sanctions. However, there's another thing that we rely on too called secondary sanctions, which is the U.S. putting pressure on its allies to not do business with Iran. And so that's sort of the primary two ways that sanctions are imposed. And both of them are very important. And particularly, I think the secondary sanctions are. And so right now you have what is called the P5+1. This is the group of countries that signed on to the JCPOA in the first place. And all of them would basically be subject to secondary sanctions from the United States for doing business with Iran. However, all the countries in the P5+1, which is France, UK, China, Russia, and the US plus Germany, all of those countries except for the US are trying to stick to the nuclear deal. And so, if they comply with American sanctions, they're going to be in violation of the deal, and they don't want to be. And so it's going to be up to, this group of countries, especially the P5+1, to resist the U.S. sanctions, the secondary sanctions. And maybe we can get into some of the specific ways in which they're doing that.
Right. And I guess it's worth it to just point out, too, that all these countries want to stay within the agreement because it's economically beneficial for them. It's not because they want Iran to get a nuclear weapon or anything like that. Germany wants to sell Iran stuff, and Germany wants to buy Iranian fuel. Italy wants to sell their planes to to Iran. China has a new, plane maker that, had previously, or it has relied on GE engines up to this point, but it may look at, building their own. As we're talking about with the secondary sanctions there, let's say that this Chinese plane company, made planes, but they need to buy American engines. With these sanctions, then GE wouldn't be able to sell the engines to the Chinese planes that go to the Iranians. And so, they could look at, then buying Russian engines or building their own engine plant. And so, these are just some of the things, I think going on with these sanctions in general, and, how they end up being enforced. But, it makes money in all these, countries. Like, they create jobs with the planes they're building and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's very kind of, if you think about it, very kind of hypocritical for the U.S. to insist that the rest of the world not do business with Iran, because the U.S. doesn't really have, like, a lot of significant business with Iran. Whereas, like, for example, China, like, very much is, like, China is Iran's largest oil consumer. And so for the U.S.'s sanctions to really mean something, they're really going to have to put pressure on other countries to go along with them, and that does not appear to be the case, at least as far as we can see.
And I'm sure part of that is geology and just the fact that Iran is, like, on the other side of the world from the U.S., so, it would make sense that all the countries around Iran would more profitably do business. Some of those countries that are wanting to continue to do business with Iran and starting to bump up against some, geopolitical issues with the United States, and mainly what's been reported on is the EU countries. Now, part of this reporting and focus on this may be, kind of the whole anti-Trump thing, and Trump being friendlier with Russia than with our NATO allies and etc. However, there's now these very real tensions being caused because, at least as far as I've been able to read, the EU is saying that they are not going to comply with the U.S. sanctions against Iran.
Yeah, exactly. That's precisely the case. So, like, in May, the month, just I think even a week after Trump announced that he'd be getting out of the Iran deal, the foreign ministers, I believe, of France, Germany, and the UK, and Iran were already kind of getting together, and they were talking about a 9-point, like, action plan to keep Iran in from the cold in terms of, like, trade and finance and stuff. And so one of the things that the EU officials are actually doing right now is they're working on what's called the blocking regulation, or the blocking statute, which is a law that was drawn up in 1996 to prohibit EU institutions, or institutions under the EU's jurisdiction, from complying with American sanctions that were then related to Cuba in the 90s. However, right now, the EU officials are trying to sort of update this law to apply to Iran. And this actually prohibits, like, EU institutions from complying with the sanctions at all. However, what the problem here is that, like, the way that the U.S. imposes these secondary sanctions is that they basically threaten foreign companies. They say that we'll like take away access of the American financial system. And so the U.S. like has this very significant carrot or stick, or however you want to call it, to impose on European companies. And these European companies might just say, forget this blocking regulation. We want access to the U.S. financial system. And so they might actually just try to get around this regulation for the sake of staying in the good graces of the U.S. I mean, Trump just came out, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, and he promised worldwide secondary sanctions on everybody, anybody who does business with Iran. And so this is definitely something a lot of companies are going to be worrying about, getting cut off from the U.S. And I mean, already quite a few European companies have actually like pulled out of Iran. You've got a French shipping company called CMA CGM, 2 French car manufacturers called PSA and Renault, a big French oil company called Total. They've all stopped investment in operations in Iran. And the same thing goes for a big Danish shipping firm called Maersk and a German auto manufacturer called Daimler. And so you do have some sign that like you have certain European companies that seem to already be chafing under these sanctions. However, the European governments at least are pushing back. But you can really see like a difference in incentives there. The companies just want, they care about their bottom line. Whereas like in this case, the states actually seem to be in a position where they might be thinking more long term.
Right. And I'm sure for the European companies in particular, just the heavy amount of business that's been done, with the ties between the United States and with, we have an extremely large economy. We're an extremely wealthy country as compared to Iran, which isn't quite so wealthy. And, they have a large population of 80 million. I don't want to undersell the importance of Iran, but at the same time, let's face it, they're no world empire. And so that definitely, I'm sure, plays a factor with a lot of these. If you gotta choose, it would make sense to choose the Americans.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So like that's really going to be like a huge consideration for a lot of these European companies. Protest as the European governments might, or the European Union or European Commission might. A lot of these companies, are going to find that their interest lies with continued relations with the U.S.
Right. And that's not necessarily because these are good companies that are going along with the sanctions because they're scared of the evil Iranians. And I think that's important. One of the things you brought up, Will, was this SWIFT organization. And do you want to talk about that and what role it's going to play in the enforcement of the secondary sanctions?
Yeah, definitely. So there is an institution called SWIFT, and that's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It's a very long acronym. But this is an institution based in Brussels, and it basically facilitates like worldwide financial transactions. And fortunately for people who are against these sanctions, this institution is based in the EU. And so hopefully this blocking regulation will apply to it. However, if the US can get to this SWIFT institution with its sanctions and get them to comply, basically this will cripple Iran's ability to do financial transactions with the world. And so if the EU, if they really mean business about trying to block these sanctions, they will really, insist that SWIFT, remains in their orbit and does not comply with US sanctions. Because again, that could totally cripple Iran's ability to do business with the world, just through this one conduit.
Will, I'm not sure if this is even like the right question to ask, but are you aware if the SWIFT has like a deadline for when they would make an announcement, or where you would expect or when you would expect to hear what's kind of going to happen and how that's going to unfold?
I'm not exactly sure. I don't think it's quite yet a foregone conclusion that the Trump administration will actually try to impose secondary sanctions on SWIFT. It's just like that is a choke point where like if the U.S. administration is smart, if they're smart about their own game, that is something they would go for. And so we're not even quite sure if SWIFT is going to be targeted by secondary sanctions yet. It's just that it's an extremely vulnerable institution, that if that were targeted, that's going to be very significant to Iran's ability to continue trading.
Right. So the Trump administration is serious about their sanctions against Iran. This would be the target in Europe about getting those enforced.
Exactly.
There are some other countries other than the EU that are, very unhappy and unwilling to go along with the U.S. sanctions against Iran. And I think one making a lot of waves is China. I've already talked a little bit about this Chinese airline company that's actually looking to come in and fill a void within China and maybe gain away from using U.S. engines because of the sanctions. But, Will, what do you think about the China issue here?
Yeah, I may have mentioned this briefly earlier, but yeah, China is actually Iran's largest oil, petroleum consumer or customer. And so, China remaining in Iran's orbit is going to be super important. And I believe actually that the Chinese government has made a statement to that effect, that I'm not sure about their broader position on the rest of the sanctions, but at least on the oil sanctions, China says we're not going along with that.
Right. And it's important to remember that with the oil sanctions, those don't kick in until November. And so while it may be a hot topic right now with Europe, because it seems like a lot of the European trade is based in these commodities, cars, planes, stuff like that was actually sanctioned in this most latest round of sanctioning. The Chinese stuff may come later. Now there's other countries that, are defying the U.S. sanctions, are saying they are. Russia, but this was, I think, a little bit more of an obvious play. India has talked about not abiding by some of the sanctions and asserting that, it's their sovereign right to do what they want. One of the interesting countries that says that they're not going to comply with the oil sanctions is Turkey, because Turkey is a U.S. NATO ally and just kind of doing some interesting things geopolitically right now. So, Will, do you have anything to add to the Turkish situation?
I haven't actually seen much on the Turkish angle. However, there was another country, I think, that was proposing something about going back to barter in order to get around the sanctions. I think you know a little more about that.
Right, that's Sri Lanka has talked about just, I guess they roughly export the same amount of tea, value of tea to Iran as they import of Iranian oil. So their plan was just, we're going to get around, having to do our transactions through the international banking system, which the U.S. has sanctioned, by just saying, okay, we're going to send this, ship full of tea to you, and you're going to send a couple ships of oil to us, and that's going to be how we do the deal. So, it's going to be interesting to see how things unfold. But overall, Will, it does seem like the United States withdrawing from this agreement has certainly, I don't want to say really harmed the U.S. geopolitically, but it certainly seems to be showing that you can stand up to U.S. sanctions and say absolutely not. And when even if Donald Trump is going to throw a hissy fit and try to do something about Iran here, he may not be able to get all these countries to go along with the sanctions. And that does seem to be something a little bit different.
Yeah, the world really does seem to be chafing under this this proposed sanctions regime. Again, with Trump announcing worldwide secondary sanctions, so everybody is going to be under this. A lot of people wish to do business with the Iranians, and it doesn't, serve them to go along with the U.S.'s whims here. I think what we are kind of seeing is some tension, and this is a good development, I think, is the creation of some tension between the United States and some of its satellite states, in the American empire, particularly in the EU. So I think that's sort of although it is it's ominous and bad, I see sort of some silver lining to this tension.
All right. Well, the last thing I want to wrap up with, Will, and that is, the reason I think that, the Trump administration says we need to do this against Iran is that Iran is such an evil menace and such a problem for the United States. So, I know there's a lot we could talk about here because the United States, claims Iran has a finger in every nefarious pie, whether it be Syria, Lebanon, or 9/11 Al-Qaeda they've been blamed for. I just saw some guy I know that supports Alex, is a big Alex Jones guy was saying that Iran was responsible for 9/11 and that, they have also, supported and are the leading state sponsor of terror and they're fueling the Yemen war. But it turns out that a lot of these things aren't true. But do you just want to talk about, is Iran a threat to the U.S.?
Yeah, I would definitely say not. Certainly not in any kind of realistic or, significant sense. Iran itself is really kind of a bête noire and has been sort of like a boogeyman of a particular segment of the right. It's usually a very pro-Israel kind of type of people. But they always sell this idea that Iran is this great threat. And there's often, Fox News is a great outlet for this where you can see this kind of hysteria all the time about Iran. But really, let's look at Iran. I mean, what is their military like? What is their, what are their capabilities? They have a pretty, big population. Certainly they have a mountainous terrain. I think certainly we could say that it would be a very huge quagmire and a really, really costly endeavor to try to invade Iran. But in terms of Iran having any kind of offensive capability, they have none. Yeah, so we were talking off air about how, Iran has this fleet of fiberglass speedboats, which, certainly if in war games it's actually been discovered that if the U.S. tried to invade Iran, they could certainly impose a lot of damage and a lot of cost on the U.S. But these fiberglass speedboats, they wouldn't even make it through the ocean. The waves would tear them up. And so in terms of having any kind of blue water navy or any nuclear force or anything like that, Iran is sort of a paper tiger. They could not possibly invade the U.S. All they really have a capability of doing is sort of stymieing and screwing up, American interventionism abroad, thousands of miles away from our own borders.
Right, and most of what Iran does abroad, at least from 2014 on, has been to fight against the, Sunni Islamic jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq or ISIS or al-Nusra in Syria, and by backing Bashar al-Assad against the jihadists. And certainly, me and Will have discussed in the past how the Iranian support from the Houthis is a real question mark and definitely not the case. And look, Hezbollah isn't a terrorist organization and, maybe there's some roots there, but certainly hasn't been for a long time. And so, to try to call Iran the leading state sponsor of terror or anything like that just simply is not the case at all. And it's been more our Gulf Arab allies that have backed the groups that are considered the enemies of the American people. However, they don't face the wrath of American sanctions. Rather, they get massive weapon sales from the United States.
Right, exactly. So the double standards at play with Iran are kind of fascinating. It's really incredible how the accusations that get made about Iran compared to the reality.
Well, I think this is one of the more important stories going on right now, and I think it's going to take a long time to develop and play out. But what we're really talking about here is U.S. tensions with Iran that could one day very possibly lead to a war. And I think a large part of that is because people are just so misinformed about Iran and have no idea that Iran isn't actually a threat to the United States. And I think talking about the sanctions now and being able to refer back to this later and point out that, how we were saying, hey, this is going to hurt the Iranian economy. But guess what? It's going to gel the Iranian people together and help them to be more staunchly supportive of their regime against the potential outside threat. And so when people are saying, oh, the sanctions are working, the Iranians are starving to death, but they haven't overthrown the leader yet. well, that's just part of it. And I also think a reason why these sanctions in particular are so important is because I do think that we're going to start to see a lot of countries in the international community reject what the United States is trying to do abroad and say, you know what, we're going to trade with the Iranians. It's profitable to us, and they didn't do anything wrong in the first place. And I think for, the first time in a long time, they're going to be able to kind of just say, forget you, United States, we're going to do things our own way. And that should be noted as a very important development.
Absolutely. I agree. I think that's like an important takeaway here is like, while there is a lot of like, worry and danger in terms of the tension and hostilities with Iran, because we shouldn't forget that, the U.S. has actually been very close to invading Iran in the past under the Bush administration, Bush Jr. Your audience can look into that a little bit if they don't, if they're not aware.
Well, I mean, there's certainly enough fanatical people within the Trump administration, the Pompeos, the Boltons, who, whether it's because, they have like this ideologically like religious fundamental belief, I think more in the case of Pompeo that, the Muslim people are like in an internal struggle against the West, and that, Iran is one of the hearts of the Muslim culture, which, he's wrong about that in a lot of ways, especially, where you want to look at the holiest sites in Islam are located in Saudi Arabia and not in Iran. And 14 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia and none were Iranian. But this is kind of his interpretation. John Bolton, I think, is a little bit more of a great game player and probably not quite so concerned about the whole, Muslim West issue, but definitely sees Iran as a chess piece on the board that is hostile to the Americans and, has long attempted to knock it over. And there's just a lot of general hostility, and, nobody in the media really goes to Iran and reports what the Iranian people think or say or want in this world or what their opinions are as regarding America. And the fact that, as repressive as the state of Iran is certainly no Saudi Arabia. And these kind of things are never mentioned or pointed out. I mean, the Saudis just crucified a guy. They cut a guy's head off, they nailed him to a cross, and they put him on public display. You know what I mean? Like, these things go on in our allied states and nobody reports on them. And then, they have laws the Iranian, the police in Tehran stop enforcing the, full face scarf, laws or something like this. And, that goes unreported. So, while I'm not trying to glorify the Iranian regime or anything like that, or necessarily say that, we should be celebrating what's going on politically in Iran, nobody talks to the people and sees what's going on over there. So they're never seen as human. And, I think that's a big problem. And so, it's just important to talk about.
Right, exactly. And before I lost my train of thought there, my last takeaway that I wanted to get was that despite the sort of risk of the conflict with Iran, we should sort of see the tensions between the U.S. and its allies as a silver lining. So I think that is that's a good development there.
Right. Especially when it comes to our allies wanting to trade with the country and us, not wanting to. It's good that at least somebody's moving that way and our allies aren't like agitating against us for war, like the mainstream media is doing with North Korea. But, let's wrap up before we get off on that tangent. We'll tell people where to find you and, what you've been up to. And, you got any articles coming out or anything like that?
Yeah, I got a couple things in the works right now, actually. You guys can find me, your audience can find me at, antiwar.com in the viewpoint section, libertarianinstitute.org in the, featured article section, and hopefully soon in the blog, I'll have something new there. And then also at Consortium News. But yeah, I've got a couple things in the works. I'm working on something on Yemen, again, looking at casualty numbers. Maybe a little thing on Iran, basically along the lines of what we just discussed, might appear in the blog later tonight at the Libertarian Institute. And I think I've got something on Syria, too, just like a little blog posty type of thing.
All right. And, for those of you who want to incentivize Will to do more journalism, because, incentivizing a guy to write great things about the war issue is a really important thing to do, Will, tell him what your Patreon page is.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's patreon.com/WKP journalist.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on. And you can find the show at libertarianinstitute.org. It's on the homepage, and you can find my news roundup there as well. Immersionnews.com is my news website. It's pretty cool. Check it out. And then patreon.com/foreign policy focus if you want to donate to the show and get great bonus content. I just put up an episode I did with the host of Liberty Weekly, Pat McFarlane. We just chat about some stuff off air, but I think it's a pretty cool kind of thing, and y'all should check it out. Thanks, everyone.